because the war is now morphing. It's going to places that we haven't heard of before. To the American people, we're going to follow the terrorists wherever they go. We're going to use whatever means we need to with partners to destroy them, and whatever time it takes, it takes. And most people are not ready for that, but I am.
Are we going to need a new war authorization? It sounds like you're arguing no, but by the way, you're going to be in the minority, aren't you?
I don't know. I'm arguing that the current authorization, as long as it's related to radical Islam, is enough. But here's, the military determines who the threats are. Right. They come up with the engagement policy, and if we don't like what the military does, we can defund the operation. But I didn't know there was 1,000.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I am doing well,
Good.
And we're going to be talking about Africa. We've talked about Africa a little bit more lately.
Yeah, it's in the news.
Since our government has solved all the problems of remaking the Middle East, and everything's going on. But I want to follow up on that quote that we had on the screen there from one of our least favorite senators, Graham. I guess if you wanted to find one individual who had the most opposite opinion from our opinion on foreign policy, he and McCain would compete for that. Yeah. But anyway, I want to quote the Washington Post because it's very much the same quote. I mean, Graham is not bashful, about his position. And this is what he was quoted as saying in the Washington Post. You're going to see more action in Africa, not less. You're going to see more aggression by the United States toward our enemies, not less. You're going to have decisions being made not in the White House, but out in the field. He didn't mention about the Congress.
Yeah. Congress is AWOL.
Right. So this is a real mess. Looks like it's going to expand, and I imagine we can't expect too much from the Congress.
I think the neocons are selling this as the next big thing. This is going to be it. We don't want to invade North Korea quite yet, but we're going to go ahead and invade Africa. And the quote got cut off a little bit at the end, but really the punchline of the interview between Graham and on the show was, I didn't know there was 1,000 troops in Niger, and that is key. And as a matter of fact, another member of the Senate who's on our more favorite side has this quote that we want to put up in response to even Lindsey Graham not knowing we've got 1,000 troops fighting in this country. If we have that tweet that we can bring up, it's Senator Rand Paul. Well, you're in too many wars in too many places when even warmonger Lindsey Graham can't keep track anymore. That was very nasty.
I understand there was some kickback from that. He didn't like that, and there was some people who were defending Graham on this too. But obviously, Rand's on the right track here. What do you think about using the word warmonger? Is that a little bit extreme? I think I've used that term, and I think we probably have used it on our program here.
Yeah, and it's funny because after this came out, and it did get a little bit of a buzz, but and I don't know if it's exactly related, but John McCain came out and said, we should really treat each other, the senators, with more respect. And I thought back, isn't that funny? Because it wasn't that many months ago when Senator Paul was opposing Montenegro joining NATO, that John McCain went down to the floor and he said specifically, Rand Paul is working for Vladimir Putin because he didn't want to expand. So what are you talking about respect?
Yeah. At this meeting they had, it was Dunford and Mattis was meeting with Graham and McCain. And Dunford had a meeting, with the press afterwards, and he was emphasizing the same position. He wasn't too far removed from this, about going to find any terrorist group wherever, and he says simultaneously, wherever they are, we'll go. And where we anticipate that they might go. How could anything be more open? That reminds us of, the preemptive war, not until we're attacked. I mean, a preemptive or preventive war of the Bush doctrine, and it's just more of the same. And it was more or less endorsed by Republicans and Democrats because Obama, followed it a little bit differently, but, they went to Libya and Syria and Ukraine and all these places. So I would say that this to go any place. But then the subject comes up about authority, and I think Graham was, pretty clear on his belief on it. no need for any more authority explicitly. And of course, others were arguing. They say, "Oh yeah, we got this open-ended authority in in 2001, right after 9/11. That justifies all of this. Totally secret stuff too. They don't even want. Matter of fact, that's his position. He's probably not even surprised he doesn't know. He probably thinks, well, that's the way it should be. We're not supposed to have oversight, let alone for the American people, even the senators. But it is a shame, and that's why it's out of control, and that's why it's so dangerous.
Yeah, it is the Bush doctrine on steroids. But here's where Graham completely misrepresents the 9/11 authorization. When Chuck Todd asked him, do you think this authorization we have is fine? He said, quote, as long as it's about radical Islam, we don't need a new authorization. Well, I read the bill on the 9/11 bill. I'm sure you read it many times before you voted. I don't remember there being anything in there about it being a war on radical Islam.
No, it had a lot to do with those responsible for 9/11 and long time dead, essentially, from that. But anyway, that's not unusual for governments to distort and use law differently than what even the Congress says. Congress writes a law, and then the executive branch writes regulations. That same principle applies to foreign policy. They said, well, you go and do this, but then that means there's no limit. That just initiates it. Nobody even talks about the War Powers Resolution. Not that that was the solution, but this idea that there was supposed to be a little more oversight after the Vietnam War, but that doesn't even come up for discussion. They're just out there. Now, when this was challenged, finally, I think it was a political stunt to even call attention to those 4 individuals being killed in Niger, and that was political stuff going on there, who's blamed what and who made the phone calls. But, when we first brought this up earlier, last week, and we said, I looked up a map and it said that we were in like 17 countries, and we had a map of which was acknowledged where we were. And I said, we probably missed some. And I said, well, it didn't even have Libya on there. But now, when the Pentagon and the administrations had some pressure on them, instead of having 100 people there, they're admitting we have 6,000 people in Africa, and that they even put the number out. They say we have some military in 53 of the 54 countries in Africa. That's pretty expensive.
Talk about an occupation. You made a good point about the only thing we've heard about the Niger thing, these 4 troops being killed, of course, but the main thing has been this ridiculous, phony controversy over the president's phone call to the widow of one of those killed. Back and forth. And all the talking heads play their appointed roles. The Republicans are going to say one thing, the Democrats are saying the other, and no one is talking about why are we there. No one's talking about what they're doing. It's all this phony, contrived thing. We used to have allies on the left when we were opposing the Bush doctrine of preemptive war. That is mostly evaporated now. It's evaporated into this ridiculous name-calling over what Bush said on the phone.
And
what Trump said on the phone, sorry.
Right. And, the Pentagon admits that they're going to increase military activity in Africa. They didn't come get permission or explain it. It's only when it's found out, then they'll say that they are doing it. They said that's part of their global strategy. What is the global strategy? Well, we suspect we know what it is. It has to do with a new world order, but we're going to be in charge, and Trump is not going to let other people do it, so we're going to continue with our imperialism and our empire. And I think that is the strategy. But there was some war games. War games are games. They're not serious. They've just finished some over there in South Korea. But they're significant. It's propaganda. They send in messages. They're threats and intimidations. But they had some war games recently on what might happen in 2020, I think. And it was, the taking over of Africa. And when I read it, the little note I wrote to myself was, I think they suggested be 2024, I said, or sooner.
Yeah.
But they're already really involved in setting the stage for this. But isn't it absolutely ironic and unbelievable. You know, we have a policy of these last 15 years or so, or well, even longer. We failed in Korea to solve that problem. We're still fighting that war. And then we had a total failure in Vietnam. And then we moved our strategy. We were going to go to remake the Middle East. Both parties have been supporting, you know, all this activity going on, and all of a sudden there's total failure here. Look at Afghanistan and Iraq and the tendency to try to start a war with Iran. So they're a little frustrated with that. There's not many victories. It looks like Iran and Russia have gained more from our policies than we have. So now they're shifting, you know, to Africa. What makes them think that they're going to solve the problems of Africa any better than they've solved the problems of the Middle East?
And that was a great quote you had when we were talking about the show before we started. You said, why not go to Africa? They lost everywhere else. You know, they had a streak of losing. And we even saw this just this past week when Tillerson was in Iraq, and he made this statement that all of the foreign fighters in Iraq must go, you know, must go back. Of course, he wasn't talking about the Americans. He was talking about what he thinks are Iranians. But the prime minister of Iraq said, these are Iraqi citizens. These are militias, Shia militias. And there was some pushback. So even the U.S. and the Iranian militias said the U.S. actually is the one that needs to go. You're the foreign troops here.
You know, and what they won't even consider and they won't recognize is that the foreign policy of intervention and our aggression over there is the reason we have terrorists wanting to kill us. I mean, in Nigeria, they were disgusted with us being there. The people, I mean, there's civil strife there, but you never know who's on which side. But they wanted to make a point, just like they did in Mogadishu several years ago, you know, 1990, you know, where we were there. The people just don't like us there. So this whole Graham policy of being there, no matter where, go, is the incentive and the opportunity for killing Americans. Yes, they've even come here, but it was said that bin Laden said that, fine, they're coming over here, which shocked him, you know, after 9/11. He said it'll be much easier to kill Americans. And think how many Americans have died since that time, and nothing ever changes. And I think Rand, absolutely on the right track, but he's a lonely voice up there on, you know, trying to change policy, because it's an argument about and being very aggressive of using the authority right now, or having new authority which they could interpret any way they want. But they're not. Where is it? Just remove it. Use the original authority, which meant that the people spoke through their Congress and a declaration, and then permit the president to, you know, use military force. But now the administration said, we don't tip our hand. We don't tell people what we're going to do. And here, lo and behold, we have this happen. And then this headline, once again, senators stunned to discover we have 1,000 troops in Niger.
Yeah. And, you know, of course, then what Graham does is he does scaremongering, just like he did in 2002. And before that, he said, we don't want the next 9/11 to come from Niger. You know, this is the whole scaring people. Don't question this, otherwise you're complicit. And this is the other thing that he said that's very interesting, because this is it. Why are we in Africa? Here's what he said. I worry that the ungoverned spaces in Africa is where the terrorists will come from after you defeat them in Syria, in Iraq, and Afghanistan. So why are there ungoverned places in Africa? Why are there places in chaos in Africa? Well, it's U.S. interventionism. It's the invasion, more than anything else, the invasion of Libya. We've talked about this so many times on the show. It simply opened the floodgates of weapons through Africa. They all got into the hands of terrorists, Mali, Niger, and on and on. This is a direct result of Hillary Clinton's support. And we hear that Obama was against it initially. Hillary Clinton's big project, we're going to fix Libya. That's the whole problem in Africa.
But it's also aggravated by the movement of the fighters, the terrorists, the fighters, the radicals in Libya. They go into Syria. And now that Syria's conditions have changed dramatically, it's suggested now that they're leaving, going back into Africa, into Libya. And I suspect we'll be talking about Libya before it's too long.
Very soon we will, because they can operate there. There's no government. There's no And not that we're in favor of having governments, but it's ruled by lawless gangs, and it's a perfect place for them to be.
Yeah, and I just don't see how this is going to change unless we change policy. But this whole idea of accepting this is what bothers me, and turning this responsibility right now to the generals almost. And the more that they can do in secret, the better. And it's endorsed by the administration. And the president said, no, he was talking to one crowd and he says, I'm never going to show my hand. Why tell the enemy what we're going to do? And I got to thinking, well, when did we get the enemy? And it's the American people who should know. So are the American people the enemy? I'm sure he doesn't think that, and that's not intended. But that's sort of what happened. It's sort of like, you know, we were attacked on 9/11, and therefore we said, well, we were attacked because we were free and because we were prosperous and all those lies, and yet all the conditions were directed toward us. We have been punished. We were punished for this, and it's ongoing. I understand, right? Like the TSA now is going to be tougher pretty soon. They're getting tougher on carrying our laptops on airports, on airplanes and all. So punish the American people. It's all this intimidation, authoritarianism, and control. And it seems like the voice of liberty is weak. But it's still there, and that we have to energize it the way I see it.
Exactly, and where is Congress? Totally ignored. They're too busy worrying whether the Russians took out a Facebook ad. Meanwhile, we're invading Africa. But you mentioned earlier, and I'll just close with this if that's okay. You mentioned there are a few heroes up there left, and that is mostly true. And Rand, of course, did a great job with that tweet, and it got a lot of attention. I'd also like to mention Representative Walter Jones, who's on the board of the Ron Paul Institute and an old friend of ours. But he's always been a voice for the troops. Everyone wants to speak for the troops, but nobody really cares that much about the troops, the people that send them off to die. He sent a letter to Defense Secretary Mattis after these 4 were killed. And he said, the American people, specifically our military families, deserve to know what is going on when they send their sons and daughters to risk their lives for their country. What was their mission? So he is very concerned about what's happened to these people. And if I can indulge you for one more second for a final word, I just want to remind our audience that this is the last week to get your personalized copy of Ron Paul's new book, The Revolution at 10 Years. There's a 2-step process. It's very easy. If you happen to miss it here, you can go to the Ron Paul Institute website, ronpaulinstitute.org. At the end of October, I'm afraid we have to close this opportunity to everyone.
And I want to thank the audience for being with us today. And I want to just close on talking a little bit about the need for authority. And some of the members of Congress believe that we need a new authority to use military force. Of course, it's totally unnecessary. No matter what they do, will be misinterpreted. The War Powers Resolution in 1973 totally ignore. They don't follow it. They don't follow the Constitution. And they're not going to change in Washington. Yes, we have a few people, and it's very vital that they speak out. I remember at times where I would vote by myself, and somebody who wanted it to be unanimous would come over, please change it, because we don't like it. I said, why do you need my vote changed? You have everybody else. People won't pay any attention. Of course, I knew differently, because what they couldn't stand is somebody standing up and saying, maybe you're wrong, and maybe have credibility. So this is the problem with what we're doing with this authority. They do whatever they want, but if you point it out and they say, really you don't, but it isn't going to come from Washington. We will have the leaders in Washington. There will always be a few, but the leadership has to come outside of Washington, and the people have to make the decision on what they really want. And that is, the people have to decide that let's get out of war. Tragically, it ends poorly because we stay too long, and there's such a tragedy, such as in Vietnam, and finally the people wake up. And at other times, countries extend themselves too far, and the empires bring them down on financial reasons. So who knows how it will end, but it can't continue this way. but the American people have to do what they can to send out the message and send that message to Congress so the viewpoints change. And fortunately, we do have the internet to express ourselves the best we can. But because the media really is not on our side, and the Republican Party and the Democrat Party, they're not with us either. It's the establishment, it's the New World Order, it's the deep state that has to be exposed. When they are exposed, especially when this thing comes down on us, we will have the opportunity, because I think the message of a liberty is alive and well, economically speaking, and the people now who are fed up with these wars, we hear from them all the time. So it's out there, but we need, a lot more activity. We need a lot more involvement and a lot more understanding, because numbers do count eventually. But originally, though, ideas are what counts. That makes all the difference in the world. And an idea whose time has come can't be stopped by the army or the governments. And that is the reason I'm optimistic that the ideas of peace and prosperity will prevail. And I think that is worth working for. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.